No matter how hard we fly, those who have watched us crying can figure how love has died. But it's alright, it can still go on. But it's alright, it can still go on. But it's alright, it can still go on. But it's alright, it can still go on.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Zanele, and before we begin, I'll just be taking us through some webinar guidelines. November has been Feminist Republic Pamoja Month, which has been a whole month with over 13 activities ranging from conversations, Twitter chats, blogs, music, and film screenings, all honoring, highlighting, and celebrating the work, passion, and resistance of African women human rights defenders. The month has spurred emotions, dialogue, and we also hope that it has provided relaxation and restoration. Most importantly, it has been a month created by us and for us. I'd like to start by giving the disclaimer that this session will be recorded for Feminist Republic documentation purposes. Please be mindful and let us respect each other's privacy. Please refrain from taking screenshots or pictures of participants' videos while they are on. The chat icon in the middle of your screen allows you to type any questions to panelists and attendees. When entering the gathering, your mic was automatically put on mute. Kindly feel free to use the chat box for any comments or questions or to flag the moderators. You can use the raise hand icon if you would like to be unmuted when we give the floor for questions. For this gathering, we have French and English options available. You'll see at the bottom of your screen is the globe icon for interpretation. Please click that and choose either English or French. We also have international sign language interpretation, which will be done by Nancy and Minnie, which you can see pinned on your screen. Other than that, thank you for joining us. And I would like to invite Wana to tell us a little bit about the piece she'll be sharing with us today. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you again for inviting me to this gathering. I feel like I got the honor and privilege to open the month, and I get the honor and privilege, extra privilege to close the month as well. And so as a result, I thought to myself, you know, one of the things that have been so powerful about this month and this festival or this event has been the fact that there's been a sister circle that's been developed. And so this poem I'm going to share with you is titled Sister Circle. And for me, it was inspired by the fact that I feel like a lot of the time we don't realize the power that we have amongst each other, and how I even think it's our sisters that are going to do the saving. We're the ones who are going to save ourselves and push ourselves and move ourselves into the next phase of our lives and in the work that we're trying to do as well as African feminists. So this is titled Sister Circle. The women in my sister circle stage an intervention. One after each other, they take the stand. A trifecta of tenderness tethered to the thought that I deserve better. Testifying of the light in me that I refuse to embrace. This is not an indictment. They say I need to learn how to be loved. My mouth spits desires, but my body refuses to wrap itself around it. I have pushed love so far away that even hope becomes a trigger warning. These women know that I hold my resilience like excess baggage. Adorn my scars like medals of honor. There is a hunch on my back, and even the keloids have become second skin. This itch is evidence that I have never known a life without discomfort. Dragging these ankles beneath all these weights, ligaments wearing out, I am guilty on all charges. I don't know how to tell them that when you have been a burden for so long, you give away all of yourself, asking for nothing in return. This is the only way you know how to be useful. You love others instead because loving yourself feels like a waste of time. I don't know how to tell them that the only love I've ever seen was sacrificial and there were no guarantees that it will keep you warm at night. You see, girls like me have to pay our way to be loved because nothing comes for free when you come with baggage and trauma and extra skin. It is too much for anybody to take. And so this is how self-sufficiency became a survival mechanism. I've always known that everything good will come to an end, and stowed away in the back of my cerebrum is this giant broth of resentment that nothing and no one will stay. So I find ways to strangle everyone with kindness, even when I am the one dying. And when the room becomes syrupy with all of my fear, these women pour more wine, more gin, more of anything hard enough to steady my quivering heart. They empty bottles in libation to my life sentencing of collecting unwavering love. Demand of me to reimagine a life where perseverance isn't thawing in my throat. They remind me that in my mother's language, the translation for courage is to hold my heart in my hand. They say I wasn't always this scared thing with scales and spikes on my skin. So instead of resilience, they ask me to make a masterpiece of joy. They say, don't look back. Leave the baggage at the door where it belongs. These women in my sister circle prop me up, straighten my spine, piece together all of my rupturing bones, and they command me to move. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yes, we can, those who can be seen can wave to say thank you so much for that. I think many of us empathize or sort of see ourselves in that. My name's Muthoni Wanyeki, and I have been asked to help moderate this session today. We have some great panelists just to help us kick off, but all of you are expected to contribute as well, because we all have ideas on this session, which is entitled Ubuntu Care and Connection, the Lessons of This Moment. And as Zanella has said, it ends the Feminist Republic's Pamoja Month, which honors African feminist human rights defenders. It also comes just a few days into, a few days into the 16 days of activism against violence against women. So with all of those things, the session title with Ubuntu in it, the month, Pamoja in it, and the 16 days is the idea that our existences are really mutually dependent, that we need to be together, and the reminder about why we need to be together, given the reality of violence, emotional, mental, physical, that our amazing poet just captured, as well as the organizing to address this violence beyond our own borders. in the title too is this idea of this moment. As we all know, this has been a year of COVID-19, the responses to it, or lack of responses to it, or imperfect responses to it globally, the failures of multilateralism continentally, what we saw on the one hand about a pretty organized, cohesive response from the African Union, as well as the Africa CDC, but then the reflection of that varying quite differently across our different states. The amazing kind of community outpouring to deal both with the health impacts, but of course in Africa, the real economic and gendered impacts of COVID-19. It's also been a year of the American explosion around the need for racial justice and transnational solidarity, including in Africa for anti-Black racist organizing, and organizing that the women's movement everywhere has insisted has to be intersectional. We saw the pickup of that in the Zimbabwean Lives Matter hashtag and in the End SARS hashtag. And we all know the role of feminist organizers, African feminist organizers within both of those movements, as well as how African women, activist leaders were targeted within. And within that, we've had all our own, dare I say, usual upheavals, the contested elections in Cote d'Ivoire, in Guinea, in Mali, in Tanzania, in which we saw African feminist human rights defenders really come under fire, so many fleeing into exile. Most recently, what became an internationalized internal armed conflict in Ethiopia and Tigray, and all along the Indian Ocean coastline and across the Sahel, jihadist insurgencies intertwined with intercommunal and communal versus state conflict. So it's been a lot for the continent to deal with and for us to deal with as people invested in the women's movement, the feminist movement, as people invested in the idea of organizing for a better tomorrow. But we've also seen, especially around, the incredible responses we've seen and sort of all the calls for not just a reset, but work towards a very different kind of world. The idea of crisis as opportunity, the possibilities for a reset. And we've seen too a new legitimization of the notion of care. Across the world, we've all, and including in the continent, really come to realize the value of caregivers, not just people who work within the healthcare system, predominantly women, and how the system supports them or not. We've seen, the outsized sort of deaths and infections among that category. But beyond formal healthcare workers and beyond physical health, the new attention sort of care being paid to emotional, mental health in these days of remote working for those of us who have jobs that allow us to work remotely. And so the question for this session is really, how's the African feminist movement reading and engaging with all of this? What has this moment brought home to us about care, whether it's personal care, collective care, what our institutions should be doing better for care of all of us? And with that, I'd like to introduce you to the colleagues who are going to try and engage these questions. One is going to be running a bit late, so I'll introduce her when she signs on. But with us, we have Akudo Oguaghamba. Please forgive me. You can butcher my name in response, who's the Executive Director of the Women's Health and Equal Rights Initiative, a nonprofit focused on promoting the well-being and protecting the rights of lesbian, bisexual, and queer women in Nigeria. She's a feminist, human rights educator, and defender with a master's degree in project management. She's committed to the advancement of social justice, including sexual and reproductive rights and gender equality, as well as women's economic empowerment and development. She served on many organizational governing bodies, including serving as the co-chair of the Pan-African ILGA, which is the International Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Trans, and Intersex Association from 2013 to 2018. So welcome, Akudo. We also have with us Lame Olebile, who's a Pan-Africanist, queer, feminist, who's passionate about social justice. Her experience is in human rights with a very strong background in lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, intersex issues, and a wealth of experience in that movement. She completed her studies in political science and administration and is currently pursuing a master's degree in research and public policy, while she works as a program officer with the Astrea Foundation, and also as an advisor for Frida, the Young Feminist Fund. So welcome, both of you. We're going to do this as a sort of Q&A and sort of bring the audience in earlier rather than later. We all know how these online Zoom meetings can end up being just panelists speaking and a one-way sort of thing. But for the two of them, they can take it in whatever order they feel like speaking. Thinking about this moment this year, what has this moment and this year really brought home to you about the value of self and collective care? And how's that moment connected to or triggered past experiences of the need for self and collective care? Akudo, maybe we can start with you.
Hi, thank you very much for allowing me the opportunity to start. Well, this year has been the year, honestly, I'll say that. In 2019, we were moving towards the end of the year, and I looked at the staff of our organization, and they were so exhausted. And the question I asked myself, like, Akudo, what did you do? They were so tired because we had implemented so many activities in 2019. So I had made plans, you know, how 2020 would look when we, during our implementations. And so immediately we crossed over to the 2020, we gathered together to plan the rest of the year. Lo and behold, Forces of Life had a different plan, and everything went overboard. Immediately the pandemic set in, I became confused, and really it was a very, very difficult time because people were looking at you as someone who leads an organization to know the answer and what next. But the truth was that I did not know any of that. I had no answers. I was so confused, and I actually knew that the rest of the world was confused at the same time around how we should continue or embark on this journey. And the part of, you know, the conversation that was really also very exhausting was the uncertainty part of it, not knowing what is next. Are we supposed to go back home? Are we supposed to continue to work? Who should need help more? Who should we support most of all? You know, should we put the lives of our staff at risk? An example was at the end of, in the middle of it, I was sick, but there were an arrest of about 84 women, lesbian women. And then we're not able to go to the police station to go and resolve this issue because there was a strict lockdown. And we are not able to, I was sick, I was not able to pull the strings the way I was supposed to pull the strings. So it was not only sad for me, but I was also not in a good place. It sets in, actually, no one needed to tell me that self-care is highly important and cannot be underestimated, you know? And at that time, what I did was I had to reach out to our partners and other feminist sisters, you know, to find a way to utilize their resources. However, what this year has brought home, you know, for me, it's that self-care, it's not only personal, but it is collective. It is about taking care of myself, taking care of others, and also allowing myself to be taken care of by other people. And also it's like it hit home again, the importance of solidarity. There is nothing, absolutely nothing we can do without the support and help of other people, especially our feminist sisters.
Thank you so much. There's so much in there. The idea of how the year turned out, planning, the idea of planning upside down, the expectation of being able to lead when we don't have answers ourselves and all of the uncertainty, wanting to support people we work on behalf of while needing to keep safe ourselves and being sick ourselves in some cases. And the idea which our poet pointed to of allowing ourselves to be taken care of. Lame.
Hello, everyone. So lovely to be joining you all today. Quite a number of things resonated with me. What you were talking about, Akudo. I think for me, the first thing that really struck me was this feeling of confusion, right? But I think mostly in relation to how quickly things were changing. I think locally, how we were quickly transitioning into what has now apparently become, you know, much closer to authoritarianism, how we were seeing so many different so many different countries transitioning into emergency governance systems, and what that meant for the ability of activists and civil society organizers to continue to organize in the way that they were. One thing that definitely created a sense of change, feeling like there's so very little that we can do, yet there's so many vulnerable and marginalized people who need the care, who need the support at this particular moment, because their needs are much more exacerbated by this particular context. And, you know, connected to that, this feeling that everything was so urgent. Working from home, like you, Tony, and I've been working from home for more than 2 years now for the Australia Foundation, but it felt different. It felt like you had to wake up, sit at your laptop, do the work, because this work is urgent. And I think from talking to, you know, activists and some of the grantee partners that we support, we heard the same thing, that everyone felt that in this particular moment, everything was urgent. There was very little time to sleep, very little time to rest, that we had to act, which was also true. But it also meant that for a lot of us, we neglected our own needs. I particularly, you know, I remember needing to access therapy after being in lockdown for quite a while, because I had had anxiety attacks. In addition to that, working longer hours, because I felt the urgency to be at my laptop, to be doing the work. And I think the one, perhaps my saving grace, was that our organization, our institution really was rising up to the challenge, recognizing that this was a particularly difficult moment, not just globally for everyone, but also for the staff at Australia, and the need to put in place measures to support everyone. So that was incredibly helpful. But the one thing that I think I came to realize at the end of one of the lockdowns that we were in was what it means to not be able to travel during this time. Before then, traveling so much for work, it was so important for me to be able to spend more time at home. But after being in lockdown for so long, it occurred to me that I had taken for granted the importance of feminist convenings, right? And I was reminded of how those convenings with other feminists were spaces for collective care, for rejoicing together, for thinking together, finding love there in those spaces, that it was essentially, those were community spaces. And I remember speaking to a friend of mine about how terrible it is that we haven't been able to travel, for those of us who can, travel across the country, across the region, across the world, that we haven't been able to travel to nurture, but also be nurtured by those transnational feminist connections and the ecosystems support that we belong to. So I think maybe I will stop there for now, Muthoni. Thank you.
Thanks. There's also so much in there. The idea of anxiety, at least you were able to reach out. The idea of working more. I heard a statistic that people are less productive working remotely. I was like, which people are those? I feel I've never worked so hard in my life. The idea of really realizing how we are fortunate, I think, in the movement, in the sense that we do have community that is beyond our little spaces. Many of us live in conservative societies, and I mean ideologically as well. So you find your community in broader, the little groups of progressives that exist across the world. And the idea that your institution rose to the challenge, because in that sense, I think you're lucky. I think, you worked like me for a funder that could probably afford to rise to the challenge, but that was not what we were hearing from many of our grantees. So let's talk a little about how you personally and your political community, however you define political community, experience trying to sort of realize self and collective care in all of that. I'll come back to you, Akudo. So what did you do to sort of make yourself feel better, make your community feel better, and get strength from your community?
Thank you so much again. So in response to that, my community is the lesbian, bisexual, and queer women in Nigeria. And we work with both the general LGBTI movement and the women's rights movement. Personally, what I did, I'll say I pushed, I tried personally. However, I wasn't totally, completely fine, based on the fact that I knew that a lot of women in my community were going through a lot of challenges at this time, rather. And so everything about me being fine was thinking about what do we do next around collective, providing collective care to the community. And so, especially around the lockdown, a lot of people were locked down with their family members that are homophobic and people who are not approving of their sexual orientation or gender identity. And so people were going through a lot and were forced back into the closet. And so what we did quickly was to try to set up groups, where people can talk about everything, talk about where to find food and how to move around the times, where the militaries are having roadblocks, how they're getting people, and because in Nigeria here, they set up mobile courts, and even if you're moving around, the police will catch you and take you to mobile courts, and then you have to pay fine. And so people had to use those channels to communicate. And that's actually, helped us also to have platforms to still laugh, laugh about things, have crack COVID-19 jokes, and it helps reduce anxiety and depression. And the thing that it's really When I say interesting, it's not actually really interesting, but the thing that's really interesting is that a lot of times we talk about the impact of COVID and their responses and all of that, but I figure there's so much that hasn't been documented, like the fear. And when you talk about fear, fear does not really leave you that quickly. And so it leaves like a lot of things hanging around, in your nerves. And that could cause constant anxiety, or, you flare up over nothing, and also the other impacts includes anger. Like, I realized that around that time I was really angry. I could not really point out why I was angry. Like, I was angry, like, what is going on in the world? What are we doing to ourselves? Why are we doing all we are doing to ourselves? What are we doing to the climate? Who is to be blamed? Like, really, I was looking for someone to be blamed, and as activists, like, when there is a problem and you find the root cause, and then where or channels to lobby or advocate. But this one, there is no one. And you're basically fighting nature and no one, in particular, and we were all struggling. So I was angry, and there was like bridge of trust from who? No one. There is a lot of awareness, like awareness surge going out there. Like, we were forced to stay at home, sit down in front of the television, reading things, learning things, unlearning things. So there was so much. And I think that, sadly, the next year we need to, even as we're talking about thriving this year, we're going to look next year into like resolving all these remnants of energy and anger and unnecessary emotions that we packed this year. So I thrived, and trying with my community, what we did was continue to talk about it. And after the lockdown, we tried to hike. We went out to the nature to walk, and then we hiked. We also had yoga and meditation for the community, because people were complaining about depression, being exhausted. They needed to see someone, and feel someone who is like them. So we had organized yoga and meditation, putting in consideration the social distancing, guidelines. And also we, towards around July, we had, with a few partners, we organized what we call the Wellbeing Clinic, where people were just, invited to just talk about everything and see if there's any way we can continue to provide support, for our community. This is our efforts, trying to like carve out spaces for people to like step back from work, step into work, but just have healthy platforms where they can talk and come together and share whatever challenges that they have. COVID has taught us a lot. I think it is it's important, like I mentioned earlier, for us to start looking at collective care most as crucial, as vital as we're looking towards, fighting for gender equality, fighting for social justice. It is important for us to start looking at how to listen to our bodies and to collectively care for each other, to enable us to reach the goals that we have set for us and for our different communities. Thank you.
Thanks. And we have a colleague who's commented on the chat that many governments were caught off guard because their programs already were not running properly, and NGOs were already in distress, and noting that mental health really did become a challenge for everyone as we were all anxious and panicky. And I guess in what you've said, there's the idea of finding alternative ways to stay together. So the groups that you created that were both practical during lockdown, where to get food, how to move around safely, but also provided spaces to laugh, which is important in the face of all that anger and the lack of a clear target for organizing that I think that we all felt in the beginning. And then later, sort of the importance of reading and television to sort of learn as much as we could, but also relax, exercise, so the hiking, the yoga, and then meditation, well-being. That's a lot, actually. You did a lot. Lamed?
Wow, I cannot say I did very well when it comes to self-care during our lockdowns. I do remember getting, you know, immersed into, as I was saying earlier, a state that all the work that needed to be done was so urgent that by the time that our lockdown was lifted, it really did feel like I finally had clarity. But then I also saw myself going out and spending so much time with friends and people I had not seen in a really long time in a way that I typically would not, as somebody who is mainly an introvert, right? I really enjoy spending time alone. But I think I spent so much time with other people because as someone who lives alone as well, there was that thing that the support network that I had was online, you know, and there is a huge difference. And I know a lot of our communities, we shifted our work online, therapy was made available online, it's online in order to check in and so forth. But it's really not the same. I think for a lot of people who are isolated, either because they live alone or because they live with families who are not accepting of their ideologies, their sexual orientation, their, you know, that are basically not accepting of them wholeheartedly and therefore may not be a very good support network. There was a lot of isolation that even online access could not break. If, of course, we assume that everyone is able to access the online space equally in that kind of a way. And so for me, coming out of lockdown, really, I felt that the way that I went out and spent time with friends and community members seemed like a trauma-induced response because I was spending so much time outside. And I think mainly from this fear that we were going into lockdown again, there's so much anxiety I'm making decisions I would otherwise not be making. I remember being out every weekend, literally looking for something to do every weekend, calling my friends, let's spend time together. And I think that, you know, when you were talking about Akudo, that it's going to take a while for us to work, to unravel the anxiety and the panic that set on. I hope that first we are able to recognize it for what it is. No, we're able to see how different we are after lockdown, after all of these restrictions compared to when we went into lockdown. If we're able to have that kind of self-awareness as communities and as activists, I feel like if we're able to identify how different we've been, then we might be able to address the way that we show up for each other and are able to care for each other. Because I do feel like that will be heavily impacted by our experience of lockdown. I really feel that way. And even at this moment, I think about not only as it relates to mental health, we talk a lot about how the economy, global economies are going to need to, the transition is basically, you know, it's long-term. The transition is long-term for our economies. The transition is long-term for our communities. But I also feel that the transition will be long-term for our mental health and for our ability to come back to ourselves after we've experienced the isolation and the violence and the uncertainty that has come with this entire year. And I hope that we are able to make space for that instead of immediately moving on and using economic stability as a benchmark of what is stability and what is normal and how we should be acting in that particular moment in time. Yeah, so in short, I did really struggle with self-care practices during lockdowns. And it's stuff that I'm still working on as well. You know, finding places that bring me joy, finding community, finding happiness, but also addressing the anxiety that comes with this feeling of impermanence and uncertainty and a loss of control and a loss of agency in a context where it feels like everything is constantly shifting and rapidly.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think that idea of having no control certainly resonates with me. But also, I think you've raised a really interesting point, and I've had these debates with my own friends and colleagues around, was it better to have been alone during lockdown or better to have been with people? And of course, being with people depends on whether you can bear the people that you're under lockdown with. Not to make light of, you know, people's really sort of, we all heard about the sort of rises in domestic violence, rises in cases of when this is over, we're separating. Yeah, and you, Akudo, already talked about for people who had to live with homophobic or transphobic families and what that can do to you when you've got no escape. Yeah, but I think you've also raised the point around the contradiction between sort of being naturally introverted, but when that choice of being introverted is taken away from you, when you're finally free, you sort of bust it out, and probably spent more time with family, friends, people physically out and about than you would have normally, and needing to sort of be self-aware about our own behavior under lockdown, out of lockdown, and sort of really think consciously about that rather than sort of just experiencing it reactively. One question for Akudo, which she sort of touched on and sort of is naturally segueing there. I mean, thinking about how you experienced it, what you and your organization tried to do, what do you think the broader implications are for African feminist organizing and movement building from this period? And what's the reset that you're looking for in terms of movement institutions, as well as the broader world that you're trying to build? That's for Akudo.
Okay, I'll say two things. First, I think we need, I mean, in the activist world, a culture of selflessness is usually promoted, and talking about your needs, personal needs or self-care, you know, in the face of all the oppressions, violence, and people suffering seems sometimes like it's selfish. However, we need to start talking about, because activists are people. You know, we are also the people that are going through oppression, suffering. So we take on all that pain and suffering, and we also take on the pains of others. And so in doing so, it seems like we as feminists, activists, human rights defenders, we expect, you know, each other to be super women. You know, I mean, there's nothing wrong with being super women or super anything, superman or whatever you want to call yourself, but it is also around how we, you know, have expectations, you know, the kind of expectations we have for other people. You know, it is okay to rest. That is what I have to say. It is okay for people to rest. If people are also not resting, it is also honorable to advise people to rest or help people to rest. It is also important to note, this is the second point. It is also important to note that sustainable intergenerational movement needs, it needs a culture of care as well. It means that, you know, a lot of times, although I know and understand the importance of self-care and how I can take care of myself, I also am struggling. I'm really, really struggling. And I also see people that I know and people that I love and people I work with, I see them struggle too. We're trying to meet deadlines and, you know, try to submit proposals, you know, to keep our organization running. We're also trying to resolve the needs of the community at the same time. You know, we're trying to do all of that. And at the end of the day, what we have, we're all coping. You know, I mean, coping, it helps us to go through the day, to go through everything that we want to do. But however, you know, it is important to, you know, have avenues to, you know, address trauma and have healings and find resilience, you know. And I think that if we invest in resilience practices, it will help us to get re-energized, to stay motivated, and, you know, keep moving. I'm just saying that as important as it is for economic well-being, as important as it is to fight for rights and all of that, there needs to also be, it's like preservation. That's how I think of it. It's like preserving, you know, the frontline defenders, like to invest both resources, both financial and human resources, in the field of collective care and resilience practices. This is the only way I think we can move past so much now. And now that we have what people call the new reality, some of us are still struggling to accept this new reality. I don't accept it yet, but it is what it is, you know. In order for us to navigate that, we need to come back to the table and start redrawing new plans, or, you know, start finding ways to collate our plans and build on existing plans. And this includes understanding that things like COVID happen, and how do we ensure that we continue to do the work and support, you know, each other in the process, and continue to provide profile or find resources, you know, for us to take care of ourselves. Yeah, I think that's it.
Thank you. And we'll come back to that in the second part of this. But before we take a break, I know we're being signaled that we need to take a break. I have one more question for Lame. And just it picks up on this idea that some of the self-care is sort of dealing with the demons in our own heads around rest, around trying to do it all, around saying yes when we should say no, all that sort of thing. But the other is sort of what she's calling resilience practices, including sort of anticipation of what might come and the need for resources around that. So my question for you before we go to the break is, this process, this whole Pamoja month, this session, is housed by an African Feminist Fund. How do you think the sort of generally, more broadly, the philanthropic and multilateral aid agencies pivoted or didn't to meet the moment? And how do you think they should have?
So what Akudo just shared really sort of sparked some thoughts as well. If it's okay for me to reflect on that quickly before I answer the question. This question about where we are right now. And I know that there's a lot of conversation about this being a new normal, but I think perhaps there's also a conversation about this being a process, a change process, a transition into a different kind of state. And that, you know, as feminists, we have the power and agency to be shaping this moment, that we are in a process, and that we're not stuck where we are with all the challenges that come with this particular moment. And so, I mean, I say that because I feel like I have such a strong sense of agency. When you began talking, Muthoni, you were talking about how the possibilities in crisis, right? And I see that. I feel I see this moment as a possibility, but also as a transition. And perhaps this is me trying to figure out how to exist in this moment and not get sucked into it. That I see this as just a moment of change, that I can show up in a particular way and be part of the change, that affirms the kinds of visions that we want to achieve as feminist activists across the world. And then, you know, something keeps coming to me. The more I speak to some of our grantee partners, I sometimes get the sense, or at least there's an observation, that especially with some of the younger groups that we work with, the younger movements that we support, that there is a need for permission, almost as if people feel they need to be given permission in order to care for themselves. Like they need to be given permission to take time off work. Like they need to be given permission to demand the general operating support, or to ask for the general operating support that they need. They need to be given permission in order to request for their funding to be flexible so that they can address the safety and security needs their communities have. It's almost, it really does feel to me that hopefully we are transitioning out of a work culture where people feel that they need permission to take care of themselves, to take time off from work, to rest when they need to rest, to ask for the care that they need from their communities, from their friends, and so forth. I hope that we are transitioning out of that kind of a work culture. I hope that that is what we're learning from this moment. But in relation to the question that you specifically asked me, Muthoni, some of the things I've been reflecting on is also about how when we went in this COVID pandemic and learning about all of the violence that is, you know, exploding across the world. And I also had a moment of being in denial, feeling like really all of these horrible things are happening across the world. And then the reminder that actually this pandemic that we're in only exacerbates existing violence, existing systems of violence and inequality, and so on and so forth. And I think that that is the one thing that has sort of been emphasized within the spaces that we have been speaking with peer donors, other people in the philanthropic sector, that we do not lose sight of the fact that these are not new challenges, entirely new. It is an exacerbation and intensification of existing inequality and violence within our world, within our communities. And some of the few amazing things that I would like to uplift about the way that philanthropy responded, I think one of the most important is that, you know, we saw some donors reaching in, listening to their communities, listening in to hear what the needs are on the ground, and therefore what the response of donors needs to be, instead of, for example, sitting in, you know, in our own offices, or in this case, our own homes, and deciding how we need to respond to this moment. I feel like, according to my knowledge, there was a huge community-centered, activist-centered response because donors were listening to the communities and what they need. And also in doing so, amplifying through the use of media and other channels what the needs are, what the challenges are, and the importance of continuing support to support our movements during this time, instead of withdrawing support or shifting support. But there was also a lot of creativity, I think, in terms of responding. There was a lot of creativity in terms of also moving resources to our community members. We saw like the emergence of new partnerships with the intention of making sure that funds were readily available to communities in need, especially given that there was so many cases of violations happening at such a rapid pace. So that was really interesting, you know, the emergence of new partnerships, but also the ways in which I think for us at Australia, we looked internally to see, you know, in this moment that we are called to act, to respond very quickly, what are some of the obstacles that we can anticipate, that we absolutely have the control, the power to change. And we reached in and we made those changes in order to make those resources available to our grantee partners sooner than we usually would, given our grant-making cycles. And we did additional fundraising to support specifically COVID-19 responses for our grantee partners. And they were varied responses. Some organizations supporting their communities directly, some organizations struggling to transition to remote work, some organizations, as Akudo was saying, directly addressing the arrests and violence within communities, but the arrests of LGBTQI people and women's rights activists and human rights activists who were protesting anti-democratic practices and violence, state-sponsored violence. So I will say a little bit more later, but these are some of the ways that we really also, and lastly, I think there was a lot of learning amongst donors about how each different institutions are responding. And I know my response is limited to the donor space because that is where I currently work right now. But it was really heartening to see that we were learning together and learning about how to shift our practices in order to make funding more accessible and readily and immediately accessible in this moment in time.
Thank you so much. We've got comments starting to come in from Sophia, just sort of saying it's pretty sad that people feel they need to take permission to take care of their well-being, and given that structured quote unquote permission is critical. And then another comment from Toyin, just saying all African women human rights defender organizations have to invest in institutionalizing well-being. We can come to that. We're going to take a 5-minute music break, which people can also use to go get water, go to the bathroom, whatever they need to do. We'll see you at 10 past. You don't need to sign out. You can just turn your video off, I guess, and we'll be back at 10 past. Or you can just sit here and enjoy the music with your screens on. See you in 5 minutes.
Are they cool? then what is it the arrows can fall?
Wow, Zanella is clearly a very skilled timekeeper. We have our third panelist with us. Welcome, Amel. For those of you who don't already know her, Amel is a women's rights activist and an international development and inclusion specialist. She's currently working as Deputy Director of Prospera, the International Network of Women's Funds. She's worked for a variety of NGOs and foundations in Africa, Europe, the Middle East, and the US. And she served until recently on UAF Africa's board. So because she had to work and could only join us now, I'm going to go back to her and ask her one of the questions I asked the others earlier. Amel, you know, you're originally from the Sudan in the middle of this major transition. You were in Lebanon when the explosion happened, and there was COVID-19. So it's been a lot for you. Do you want to share what you think this year has brought home to you about the value of self and collective care? And also what it connected to or triggered about past experiences pointing to the need for self and collective care?
Thank you. Thank you, Muthoni. Hi, everyone. And I'm sorry to be joining late, but very happy to be with you all. I think what this moment has really triggered is how broken our world is, and just, you know, the systems, the systems that have failed us. I mean, we knew that already, but it's also, you know, was kind of like full blown everywhere you looked, with the people also that are most marginalized and most in need of help, like at every level, not getting the support, but also that, you know, in this moment of crisis, how things were turned around to still abuse people even more, even in this very vulnerable moment, in terms of like, you know, surveillance and violence and, you know, using all sorts of tools not to take care of people, but to break them down even further sometimes. And but it also like showed how, I mean, like, let me take, for example, the explosion here or in my home country, here in Lebanon, the explosion here in Lebanon, and in my home country in Sudan, and seeing like the total breakdown in the systems of health, for example, but was people who were coming together to help each other out and to be really innovative as well about ways that, you know, that they could compensate for this. In Lebanon, we saw like total absence of government in the wake of the explosion. And like in many of our countries, very corrupt elite, but literally people like, you know, coming, helping each other out, you know, with everything possible, with like picking up every strand of work, caring for people, providing help, like picking up and so on. And that stories feel so familiar. And I think, you know, and there is something so wrong with that picture. And at the same time, the need for compassion, for self-care, for systems that allow people to, you know, that take care of people and to like push the reset button. I've seen that in many organizations that we're working with, that the impossibility of like just continuing with business as usual, that has not been possible, and that, you know, we really need to hold each other. And I think, like, you know, in feminist organizations, in women's organizations and so on, there is a real example that they have set in how we do this work, and also in their connectedness with people at the grassroots level and being able to like reach out to the more marginalized people. But I see, like, you know, with maybe let me just close with the Urgent Action Fund Africa, for example, even before the pandemic, rolling out you know, the Feminist Republic, you know, AWDF with the Flourish Initiative, and like AIR, and like, you know, so many, like this is not But I was just like thinking back, and I was reading some of the reports, and it like every year, whether it's 2015 or 2000 or 1990, it talks about the same thing, how broken the systems are, and how bad people have it, and how we are creating the change that we want. So let me stop there.
Thanks, Amel. And, you know, this idea of the innovation, we're going to come back to that, because I think going by the chat, people are really keen to know, what does that actually look like? So we have Esther, who's asked, what does institutionalized well-being really look like for organizations? And then we have our colleague from Guinea, Dorcas, talking about access to resources, which is the other question I wanted to ask you that I had asked Lame earlier. How did you see the women's funds really pivot? You've just said that they had begun to beforehand anyway, but what did you see women's funds do to respond to needs of defenders?
And I'm like, I maybe should say that I'm just speaking, like, you know, not as Prospera or as any other organization, but just what I'm seeing as an activist who's been involved in this for a while. I've seen, you know, women's organizations and funds and other, some of the larger philanthropies also pivot in really interesting ways. For example, with the rapid response grant making becoming something that is needed, and people like pivoting to do that. People also like putting in principles of feminist care and like the need to also look at the most marginalized groups and bringing in a gender perspective. And this is not new. Like, for example, we've seen how this was done, like specifically Urgent Action Fund, like an example that comes to mind in the work that they did with the Ebola crisis, and in trying to bring that kind of perspective that others were not talking about. In terms of like, you know, also, and again, some of the larger foundations have done that, but like to pivot and like, you know, try to channel funding to resources, to resource the response to COVID-19 and provide a lot more flexibility in funding. And, you know, what maybe to the question of what institutionalizing that work of care and resourcing it, which is a really critical question. I think that there is no size fits all, and that there is, you know, that we need really multiple strategies. But what we see happening is, you know, creating the space for even that kind of discussion. And again, the Feminist Republic and I imagine a lot of people in the audience were there. What was really special as we were trying to navigate this new space is just even creating the space for coming and talking about all these different examples and like, you know, from what African traditional healing mechanisms looked like to Reiki to like, you know, and just by the sheer, like, you know, by having that space, it brought so much, it touched everyone and moved everyone that is in the room. I can say personally how much it helped me in very personal ways. And I like people being able to talk about not just how broken the systems are, but obviously how broken the systems are and the oppression and the violence on us as women, as Black people, as like, you know, activists in very repressive states, and what that does for like, you know, our psyches, for our well-being, and like there were many ways. So I think for each person, we're all in different parts of the journey, but how do we like, you know, create spaces and cultures of care where we allow people to come as whole people? And it can be in very small ways. Like I just like, you know, when I sit, like, for example, in meetings and like organizations, and Urgent Action Fund is a good example, where we start always by the political, the personal, the professional, and opening that space and allowing people to come and share where they're at so that they can be held in different ways. And then places where you know, the mainstream, where you're just, you know, shutting off and like, you know, you're coming to do business as usual, and like, you know, centering a lot of egos, very masculine. Like the difference for anybody who's in those is so stark. And the consequences of where we go from there are just, you know, I mean, they just channel the work in a very different direction. I think that sorry to be long-winded, but that just the access to resources is huge, because also, like, you know, I realize even as activists, those of us who are working in organizations who have, like, you know, livelihoods and so on that can support this, and then the majority of people who are doing this with very little resources, and the question of resourcing is really critical here, and how do we scale this up? And I think we're just at the beginning of the road here. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. So the floor is open to anyone who also wants to share. I mean, quite a few people who've commented on the chat have asked questions, but remember, we and the panelists don't have all the answers. So if there are things that people have done or experienced, or that they felt was innovative and helped them sort of not go mad during this period, help them continue the work, help their colleagues and those they're serving continue the work. Just share. We've had some ideas. So on institutionalizing is the idea, as Amel has said, just simply creating space in the agenda for people to share what they're feeling or where they're at personally before, as part of, not before, but as part of the work. We had the idea of sort of not, you shouldn't have to ask for permission to take leave or to stick to normal working hours. We had the idea of funders of sort of trying to ease procedures to enable rapid response, but also continue investing in the, you know, the problems that we all know, inequality, violence, and scale it up, seeing it not as something new that came with COVID, but really understanding, oh, this just is a continuation. So the floor is open. I don't see a hand function, but if you want to speak, maybe just type hand in the chat and I can call on you. And if, while we're waiting for colleagues to share beyond writing, Akudo, Lame, Amel, you should also feel free to jump in if you have more to share, but we really want to hear from the group. So we will pause a bit and wait for somebody to type hand. There are 42 people on this call. Surely somebody has something to share. I mean, we're all talkative. We can keep rattling on, but come on. It's a collective space. Somebody jump in.
There are hands now.
Are there? Where are they?
Yeah, we have two hands, Caroline and Esther.
Where? Oh, good.
Okay.
Carolyn, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. How are you?
Fine, thank you.
It feels good to be on this platform and just relating to what you're talking about around the issue of feminism and the issue of maybe violence and the suppression of women that we are facing, especially around this time of COVID. I'm from Zimbabwe and also coming from a very small community-based organization. But it's women-led, and me being a feminist myself would really want to have more programs that speaks on the power of women, feminism, and also just engaging women around standing up for themselves against the system of patriarchy that we are still really, that is still weighing heavily upon us. And, you know, other than access to resources from my end, which I think has been also highlighted here, one thing that I've also found to be lacking in my area is just support from others who have been doing feminist work for quite a long time. You find that with the few people who are working around this area, there's also an issue of scramble for resources. So you really don't get the support that you need, maybe even in terms of materials that we can actually use so that we can get more and more women having dialogues around feminism and realizing their own power and organizing themselves so that we can really do away with the repression that we are getting from the system and the societies that we live in. So I think from my end, it will really be good in terms of just connecting, even, you know, sometimes it would be good to really get them the resources, but also in terms of just sharing training materials, sharing pamphlets that we can actually use, and using the knowledge that we have maybe in the space to share ideas and network and share knowledge so that we can be able to give more to the people who really need our help in the communities. I think that's all I have to say for now. Thank you.
Thank you. So reiterating the point that's been made earlier, just the value of having spaces to discuss and to talk about organizing that's worked, that includes sort of an intergenerational or sort of elders or you know, people who've done it before who we can learn from. Thank you so much, Carolyn. We had briefly Esther, but I see she put her hand down. Esther, did you want to come in? Yeah, Esther, and then I'll come to Fikile.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for this amazing and very comprehensive conversation that I'm really enjoying. I just wanted to follow up on the question I had asked and to just, you know, with the work that we do around gender equality, it involves a lot of, you know, at times just working, and not even realizing that you need time to breathe and really take care of yourself. And if we are, you know, working to ensure that then we have institutional well-being for everyone, how can we ensure that even with the turnover, for example, for staff, that the new staff that come in still are able to understand this is the culture and this is how we do things, and how can we then be able to also put it as a priority and be able to get funders like Urgent Action Fund Africa that really invest in the well-being of women human rights defenders in a way that is really meaningful, that is part of the work. The, you know, gender equality work is hard work, and it's at times very exhausting, and, you know, people need to be breathed. So how can you be able to ensure that it is a culture that continues even if we have new staff? And, you know, how can we then creatively also be able to ask for resources for funders that are beyond Urgent Action Fund? Thank you.
You're muted, Muthoni.
Sorry. So the idea of how we induct new colleagues into working spaces that are trying to create space and time for people to take care of themselves in the work environment, but also the idea of how to make the case to funders that may be beyond the sort of women's funds and philanthropies that did try to kind of adapt. So we've got Fikile.
Thank you very much, Muthoni. Hi, everyone. It's really a great pleasure to see you, Akudo and Lame and Muthoni and everybody else. And truly enjoying the conversation of healing and holding together. And, you know, for many of us in South Africa, COVID has really been a challenge in the sense that I think somebody said earlier on that it really reminded us of the depth of the systems of oppression and what they've done to us as humanity, you know, just from basic needs of being able to have access to food, you know, and because many of us actually find activism spaces as our homes. And when lockdown came, it meant that we are not even able to access those spaces. Where we heal and you get a meal a day sometimes, you know, very often, and you get to speak to people. So that was hard. And I think what happened is that what also it revealed is that actually a lot of women human rights defenders are on the pavements, people that are really on the front line of the struggle. Are people that don't belong to any organization, that are not fundable because they're just not able to produce fundable documentation, located in rural areas, in marginal townships of South Africa. Really vulnerabilities were exposed. But I think in terms of the work of care and holding together, what we also found was how resilient our bodies then became even during those moments of COVID, because as much as it was a hard moment and it continues to be, it constantly reminds us that we need to be with each other. through the confines and the limitations of online organizing, we have done a lot of speaking to each other every day, and really drawing from our inner selves, variations of healing systems of who we are, drawing from indigenous knowledge systems, from Ayurvedic systems of healing, and so on, wherever we are located. And I think we drew from the fact that wherever our bodies are, as women human rights defenders in particular, we are going to hold each other. And we did a lot of things, and no, this work has happened without even funding. And it's really about saying Gige Gogo. We have this campaign that we call Gige Gogo or Gige Feminist, just to be able to access online, where a gig is 100 and so on. So, and in some cases, sharing food and sharing all kinds of things that we hold with each other, things that we take for granted sometimes when we are not locked down within organizations that we receive. So I do not want to speak a lot because I really am passionate about this subject, but suffice to say that there is place for healing in our organizing. I think that what we've seen also is important is, particularly to the donor environment, that we do need to prioritize resources for healing, because those resources are also not just financial, they are also people, they're also time, they are bodies, they are spirits. And very, very few people have interest to giving resources to the work of healing because it's intangible, it's invisible. You cannot touch pain, you cannot touch joy, you cannot touch laughter. You can't also document laughter, whereas laughter has got a place in our resilience, in our holding together, which is something we really have experienced during COVID-19. And this feminist republic, for us, many of us in South Africa, we keep coming here because when the space was opened up, it was like, oh my gosh, we want to breathe, we want to breathe. So even just to come here and being able to log in online, which is a privilege for many of us. We've got so many people that could be here but can't because they don't have data. Is a space that we value, we absolutely appreciate. And I just really want to say thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you from the bottom of our hearts for making this space available as we heal together collectively. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Fikile. So there's the idea there, a reminder, I think that Amel pointed to too, that many of our organizations that are activist spaces are also our homes, and even just the normal little practices of eating together that we can't do now are ways that, we take care of ourselves. There's the idea of people who aren't in the circles and networks and sort of in the circles, I guess, of people who have access to funders, and the need, I guess, what that implies is for us to be responsible about constantly looking out for who's doing the work, where they're doing the work, and trying to refer, share, and so on. I don't see any more hands, so let me come to Akudo and see if she has any comments on what's been said. We also have a nice suggestion from Martha from Tanzania, that even informal groups of feminists can be spaces to run to when it's all too much, which comes back to the idea of the poem, our sister circles and so on. Akudo, anything to respond? And people keep putting up your hands.
I'm going to try to respond to how does institutionalized well-being really work for organizations. In the beginning of this conversation, I talked about how we were looking for, yes, last year was really hectic for our staff, and we were looking for ways to, make better 2020. Sadly, it happened the way it did. But during my investigation, I found an organization, a friend of mine, actually in their organization in Kenya. They talked about how they take collective leave. It was really amazing, or what I learned was really amazing, based on the fact that I realized that the people that I work with, they're young women, and they are very, they're feminists, angry feminists, and so it's really, you find out that a lot of times from January to December, they don't take leave, or even when they take leave, it's like a few days. Like all of us, we have leave from like years back piled up. We haven't taken the leave. And, it started to dawn on me that, they like, just like me, or they're looking at me that, lead the organization, they don't want to go. I don't know the reason. Maybe they're they're very passionate about the work. They're not going on leave. So I'm trying to find out why and how can we actually go on leave. And I realized that, even if the director of programs goes on leave and, we need some documentations, we write emails. Or someone, the staff, one of her colleagues will call her and say, please, how do I assess it? It means that they are actually they didn't actually go on leave, So the organization said that in the middle of the year, they take a week of collective leave. Everybody will go home. They close the office, they send an email, and, and that's like, I think it is very, very, radical, and I think it's good for the health of the organization and for the staff. Another thing that we've not done this, this is part of our plan. Sadly, COVID spoiled the plan for us, but we're going to try and practice that in 2021. However, what we have tried to do is that usually we have like 3 days retreat, which is also like team building. That's when we take our hike. We go to the, waterfalls, but before then we look at the projects that we have for the year, and we just, friendly, or, like have a conversation over food or, a drink, and talk about how we're going to do these programs. But what we did is that we've had two, we had 2 planning meetings / retreats / team building, where, they can just wear shorts and slippers and come together in a room that is not our office and talk to their colleagues, and they just talk about the amazing things that they plan to do. Sometimes after that, it becomes refreshing, and, like you are energized again, to push through to the, through the next 6 months of the year. So I think it's something we have tried and it worked. And so another part to add to that, when we're talking about resources, I want to just mention it so that it will be on record that resources is not only financial. It is financial, but not only financial. It can also be people who understand better than, like the way my friends shared their practices in their organization. We can, harness such information and have like a collective point or shared point or anywhere where people can access that. And, like I mentioned before, that we had yoga meditation. Our yogi was a man, there's nothing wrong with that, but it would have been so much amazing and refreshing if we were able to find a yogi that was, female, and we looked and we did not find, so if those resources are available, or if there are other organizations that have tried other, strategies, and that we can also borrow the people that know better, then I think we will go a long way to, like achieving this collective care and resilience practices.
Thank you so much. Keep your hands coming up, people. Lame?
Oh, there we go. Thank you. I wanted to go back to something that Sophie said earlier, one of the attendees, and it reminded me of something, and I said this to a friend the other day, that, I want to live a life that I don't need to escape. And so sometimes it feels like, you know, we would work intensively until we get burnt out. And then we take leave 5 days to recover from the burnout. But we don't actually take leave just to spend more time with our families, to go and enjoy the things that we do, but that we take leave to evacuate or to exit from a stressful working environment. And so I think that, you know, maybe the question is about how do we create, and beyond thinking about formal working structures, such as formal organizations or institutions, just in our movements, you know, in acknowledgement of the different ways that we contribute to our movements, as you were saying, Akudo, right? The different people resources that we have that are positioned differently within our movements and working alongside and with organizations, that how do we create movements that, so how do we create movements or working cultures that don't need you to take leave in order to recover from burnout or from a toxic working environment? And I really want that, you know, to be possible. And I feel that a lot of the times, sometimes when we talk about well-being and care, we think about exiting stressful situations such as work. But, you know, my hope is that we can work towards working environments that acknowledge when somebody needs to rest before they hit that level of being burned out. And, you know, you have the kind of collective leadership and collective support that encourages someone to take time out, and that there's a level of shared accountability about the well-being of everybody who's part of advancing the change that we want to see. So how can we change those conditions that lead to toxic working environment, that lead to burnout? And, you know, part of it is, I think in my experience, it's been about shifting what I think is my role in organizing from a young age, going into organizing and feeling that we were somehow all expected to be martyrs. We were supposed to give our lives to the cause, to work endless hours, and that your worth is equated to how tired you are. And we're seeing a lot of this on Instagram, you know, people talking about the fact that your worth should not be tied to how tired you are, how many more hours you've worked. But the unfortunate truth is that there are still people who think this way. And it's a systemic issue, because you go into, or at least you actively become part of a movement that already holds those kinds of norms and values around work, what your significant contribution should be to the movement, and how you should look if you are significantly contributing to that movement, which is oftentimes tired, stressed, feeling like the weight of the world is on your shoulders. But I don't believe that anymore, thankfully. And I think a lot about what it means to approach the work and think about my own resilience, but that also in thinking about my own resilience, other people might also think about their own resilience. And we might shift our own norms and values in order to create movements that are concerned about the resilience of our movements, of everyone who is part of the movement. And, you know, there's a tension though, you know, there's a tension that a lot of our organizing is also formal. Many of us have organizations, formally registered organizations with staff members that are working full-time. There's a need for resources. And I think one of the participants also talked about, Caroline talked about, that it's interesting to be able to take leave, but they cannot afford to do that. And I know that this is a reality for a lot of organizations, you know, that the work is, it seems like the work is never ending. It never stops. gender-based violence does not stop. Generally, violence in our communities does not stop. But how do we create cultures that allow us to take the rest we need and then to come back ready to recommit again to our communities? And how do we do that without forming structures or systems that make it difficult for us to be flexible, right? I'm thinking particularly about some formal NGOs that, the way that funding, there's the ebb and flow of funding, and that sometimes as NGOs, we are also vulnerable to that ebb and flow. And when there is no funding, it seems as if the anchors of our movement crumble. And the anchors of our movement sometimes being NGOs that are part of our movements. But how do we organize in a way that we can protect our movements from that? But how do we also ensure that there are resources for healing and well-being? And for me, it's really the tension that I'm holding, because it is important that people who are doing full-time activism work be resourced to the extent that is necessary. Because on the other hand, the opposition, if I could call it that, which I admit is not a monolithic group or a specific group of people, but those working against us are also being resourced to a great degree. How do we match that resourcing of our movements with those who are working to undermine all the change that we are trying to achieve? Without also getting stuck in the formalization of our movements and therefore getting stuck in the dependency of funds. I don't know. Yeah, so I don't have a lot of answers.
Thank you. It's interesting, this idea of leave. I mean, our president at OSF in the summer just ordered a week for everyone to be off with no communication, no signal, no WhatsApp, no email, no whatever. And everyone came back sort of, oh my God, that was fantastic. He's now done that again for 2 weeks over the end of year break. And it's true, even when you're on leave, if you know email is still coming in, WhatsApp is still coming in, and everyone else at different parts of the planet are still working, it's pretty hard to turn off completely. So I like the idea of collective leave. But also a reminder, okay, we don't have the best sort of labor law all across the continent and the best kind of enforcement. I mean, it's really more in the breach, and even informal organizations, let alone, the informal sector. But those of us who are in formal organizations, leave is a law. I mean, it's the law. You can't be denying it. So there's also a space about understanding our rights if we work within formal organizations, and ensuring that our organizations at the bare minimum comply with, however patchy labor law is. Amel, I'm going to turn to you. And we've got 9 minutes left, and I'm not seeing hands despite my best efforts. So, but people are commenting in the chat. So after you, we'll do one sort of round again to wrap up and hopefully get like 5 minutes of music in. Amel.
Thank you. I think, agree with all these discussions about the resourcing and like philanthropy and workspaces and all that. But I think the bigger issue is how broken our systems are, because they're just so out of balance, and they are, based off a model that is largely oppressive. So even in the, working for just systems and against oppression and so on, we're working with models that are, sort of reproduce the cycle of a power structure that is very unhealthy, that's very hierarchical, that is very masculine, capitalist, like, more is better, work, like when you look at job descriptions, you're like, you know, there is enough work in one job description that can fit for 5 people. And like, why aren't we redistributing work? And like, even in like, you know, countries that are more socialist leaning or more whatever and less work and so on, like the model is wrong. Like, you know, you take leave and you can't even like, you know, take care of your kids or have like a life work balance that is healthy, not to speak of all the people who don't have work. And like, you know, like, so with this, and I mean, yes, I mean, this is intimately related with like the big picture of how wrong the world is, like, you know, how very few people control the wealth of whole societies. And we're working within this model. And, you know, how do we transform that and begin something completely different? And I think we are trying, and that struggle continues, and certainly women's organizations and women's funds and so on, in whatever arena, whether it's philanthropy or women, peace and security and so on, we try to define an agenda that is transformative, that brings in a different paradigm of work. But we're still, of course, trapped into this. And sometimes I compare, like, you know, of course, it's not easy to have, like, you know, to live in conditions that are so inhumane and dignified, and people starving and so on. But also when you look at people, when you look outside this system and like, you know, how we look at care, for example, and time, and just even philanthropy. Like I'm thinking of, like, you know, again, coming from Sudan, and which is in a country that has not seen a lot of external funding flows. And it's a blessing in so many ways. I mean, the situation absolutely dire, and gets more dire by the day for women, for men, for like poor people of, you know, so I'm not saying like, you know, I think, you know, some definitely a lot needs to change there, but also in all the ways that people have come together to support each other and to make time, and what can we learn from these structures? I mean, in looking at conflict zones, the people who've held each other, you know, coming together, and we don't talk, like we try to have a session actually with Urgent Action Fund where we try to talk about care and self-care and so on. And it's not that it isn't there, but it's not talked about in the ways that people are expressing it. And we need to tap into these ways of what are the ways of care that people, you know, hold each other up, got each other's back, and what that looks like. And I think, you know, I'm really happy to see projects that also are looking into this production of knowledge of like different alternative ways of doing this. And I can just, I mean, to name a couple of examples, the violence, even on very like, the violence that is, causes this intergenerational trauma, the registries of oppression, whether you live in an occupied territory, for example, and like that daily humiliation, and what that does to people's psyche, not only the oppressed, but also the oppressor. And that, how do we break that chain? And how do we, like, you know, come back to these, like, you know, the work, self-care, kindness, love, and all that, all these things that are not talked about, that are too feminine, they don't, like, you don't see them in work plans and so on. But that is the work. That is the work of social justice. That is the work of, you know, creating a better humanity. That is the work of like becoming whole again, of opening up, and it's just so out of balance towards destructive powers and masculinities and so on. And how do we bring that, whether you want to call it yin and yang, balance, whatever. And I think like I'm seeing that happening, and I'm seeing it, and then and maybe just to end, like I think it's not just an issue of resources, because like living in Sweden and seeing like half of the country is they've got their resources, there are good labor laws and all that, but like a lot of people are on sick leave mentally, like working in the US recently, and like the statistics are horrifying about like how people's mental health is. So what's wrong with that picture, and how do we write it? I'm sorry, very sorry for taking so long.
Thanks, Amel, for the reminder that, it's a bit what's the old quote about the master's tools? It's sort of, no, start with what the real needs are, and that's the real work. It's not an add-on. We're trying to fix something that's sort of unfixable. We only have 2 minutes left, but there's one comment in the chat, basically, actually two. One asking about what does this question of self-care and collective care mean for people, women, feminists with disabilities? And then another suggestion from Martha, where we have public space, in her case, a beach. Sometimes that's good enough to rejuvenate, just heading to the beach, drinking her homemade juice, good for you. And yeah, taking care of herself. And Toyin has been referring yogis or women to Akudo. Okay, last comments. There was room here for closing remarks, but maybe let's not give closing remarks. Let's sort of talk about takeaways. So Akudo, one takeaway for you from this conversation. She's like, you've put me on the spot.
Yes. What I'm taking away is that we actually really need each other. We do. We know we whether it is socially, whether it is just to sit down over Zoom and have tea. We just need to do this, even just being on this panel. I kind of it's feeling good, and I feel supported, and like I have a family again. So I think we do really need each other.
Thank you. Lame? One takeaway.
Just one, and it's actually from Amel. And I really appreciate the way that you keep bringing us back and trying to ground us in, the fact that what we're seeking to address. And I hope I don't misrepresent what you were saying, that what we're seeking to address is, needs to be grounded in the systemic oppression that we are basically trying to dismantle, and about the need to reflect on the structures that we've created from that perspective. So just to say thank you for situating us again, and just to thank everyone for their comments.
And Amel, you get the last word, the last takeaway. And just a reminder on the chat, Toyin's also shared a website she's creating on healing. So everyone should copy that link and have a look at it afterwards. Amel.
Thank you. And thank you all. One takeaway is maybe about someone earlier was saying about the juice and going to the sea and all these things that do not need resources. And I think that is so true. And also just beginning with radical self-love, which is so hard. It's free. And yet it's so hard to do. And that's what I'm struggling to do every day. So thanks for...
Thank you. Thank you so much. Let's wave at all the panelists and also everyone on this very shy group that was happy putting comments in the chat, but maybe a bit nervous about speaking openly. But thank you everyone who shared, however you shared. It all works. I'm going to hand back to Zanella to close us out.
Since we met you people 500 years ago, look at us. We've given everything. You are still taking. It's true. I mean, where would the whole Western world be without Africa? Our cocoa, our timber, our gold, our diamonds, our platinum, our whatever. Everything you are is us.
I don't believe in the myth of the angry black woman. I believe in the magic of blackness. See, we are the builders. We are the bridges. We are the connections that stick and that lead you to riches. You wonder where they got it from? Well, they got it from us. Their novelty is our natural. Their rehearsal is our off the cuff. If you ever feel not enough, know this. You are rubies. You are diamonds. Little black girl, you are exalted. you.